This is Pradeep from Sydney, welcoming you to yet another session from the VRAR Association. Today we have a hot button, and what that button is, it is AR, VR, XR, MR, whatever you want to call it, and cybersecurity. I get amazed at times when I look at what is happening in the cyber world. Coming from an IBM background, it is even more interesting because, from IBM perspective, it was all about process maturity and looking at all aspects of security and infrastructure and apps and all that. But when I look at what is happening in the VR, AR, XR ecosystem, I'm not sure whether there is an end-to-end perspective available in terms of cybersecurity. And this becomes very important considering that in the last 15 days, not 15 days, but 15 months, we have taken on technology like anything else. And we are spending more and more time online. But more importantly, the discussion nowadays is now going from VR, AR, XR to metaverse. And the question comes is that what is a metaverse? And metaverse is nothing but a fusion between a virtual world and a physical world where all forms of reality and the real world coexist. Now, just imagine if you are having such kind of interesting situations in the standard VR, AR, XR, what's going to happen in the metaverse? Anyway, let me kick off today. And the man on the hot seat, should I say, is Dr. Nick Tate. Dr. Nick Tate is an old friend of mine. He has just 45 years of experience in the IT industry, out of which 20 years has been in cybersecurity. He has been a CIO at 2 London banks and at University of Queensland. He has been a company director, and if I were to start counting the number of companies, it is 18 at the last count, including both from Australia as well as US. He's also a vice president of Australian Computer Society, and for 11 years has been the head of Australian Computer Emergency Response Team. What more can you talk about, Nick? But let me also add that he is also a PhD in cybersecurity and has written a book called A Director's Guide to Governing Information Technology and Cybersecurity. A big welcome to you, Nick, and everybody else. I want to kick off the session by asking you to present your thoughts on cybersecurity, as well as what you see happening in the immersive technology landscape. I've got some interesting questions lined up before that, but I will also encourage the audience to ask questions and put in your questions in the chat section, and I'll try to pick them up. So over to you, Nick. And before I do that, can I ask everybody to give a good and a loud round of applause for Nick? Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, and thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share for inviting me this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen.
That's $100 for all that introduction that I gave,
Oh, it's cheaper than I thought then,
yes.
Pradeep.
Yes, it's a special discount for you, Nick.
It is. Oh, thank you very much. I'm much appreciated. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so bear with me, and I'll get you to check that you can see it in just a minute. You can see it properly anyway. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can, Nick.
So immediately, I hope that I'm from Queensland, looking at the background. So thank you very much indeed. And you might think, those of you in Queensland, or these indeed those of you outside Queensland, might think that Noosa Beach, which is what that is a rather strange place to start a webinar like this on cybersecurity and the immersive technologies. But in the days before COVID, if you remember those days before COVID, when this picture was taken, people were pretty unconcerned, particularly on Noosa Beach, with personal safety measures, perhaps unreasonably, but they were. And I fear that we're seeing some of that lack of concern for cybersecurity issues when we look at the AR, VR ecosystem, not of course from all players. And I'm quite certain from no one on this call here today. But I might just talk about things. Pradeep asked me to talk about cybersecurity. Why should we worry about cybersecurity at all anyway? Is it really an issue? And secondly, what is it that happens when we think about cybersecurity in the context of AR and VR, or VRARA, whichever way you want to call it? And third, if it is a problem, what can we do about it? Is there much we can do? And so those are the topics that I'm going to cover broadly today. I hope I'll challenge you, or at least keep you awake for a few minutes so that you're ready to answer questions. And so I'm ready to answer some of the very tricky questions that I know Pradeep is lining up for me at the end of the session today. So the first of these topics really is, why should we really worry? Let's start at the beginning about cybersecurity. You know, is it really something in our industry generally we should worry about? Well, you can probably answer that question, but if I say to you that broadly speaking, and I'm going to categorize it today, the actors who are offensively using cybersecurity against others fall into three categories: cyber criminals, nation states, and what I've called amateurs and activists. And I hope that they and others will forgive me for putting them all together in one category. We're mostly today going to talk about cyber criminal activity because it's more relevant, although I will give an example that could be nation state activity, and we'll talk more about that later. For the criminals, I just want everyone to be aware, not everybody is completely aware, that this is a corporatized, organized big business. A group that wants to undertake an attack is likely to rent some attack software from another group. And this attack software may well come with service level agreements, warranties, and even a help desk. The group which undertakes the attack may well be a different group from the one which monetizes the outcomes from the attack. This is a sophisticated economy. I'm not absolutely clear how they enforce the service level agreements in some of the perhaps rougher parts of the cyber criminal community, and I probably don't need to know. But at the end of the day, it genuinely comes from many of these things. This is a sophisticated economy that's going on in cyber security, in the cyber criminal area. So, I mean, let's take an example recently. I'm not giving the very recent from the very recent ones today. After all, there are plenty to choose from. But let's start by considering the recent sort of rather well publicized case of the Colonial pipeline ransomware attack. So look broadly at the details. On the 7th of May, Colonial Pipeline, which is a US oil pipeline system carrying oil across a number of US states, suffered a cyber attack. It took out the largest fuel pipeline in the US and created fuel shortages across the eastern states of Australia, with petrol stations looking a bit like that in the picture there. In fact, however, the hackers had gained access to Colonial Pipeline's networks on the 29th of April, a bit earlier than that, through a single compromised password. Not much more, apparently, which gave them access to the virtual private network, or VPN, according to gentleman Charles Carmichael, who's the senior vice president at the cybersecurity firm Mandiant, who I think were looking at it. Now, the hackers allegedly stole around 100 gigabytes of the company's data, and they issued a demand that they would release it on the internet if a ransom wasn't paid. The company paid a ransom of nearly $5 million in Bitcoins, and the group calling themselves DarkSide released a statement on the 9th of May, which didn't directly mention the attack, but claimed that our goal is to make money, not create problems for society. So clearly they were altruistic types. Apparently, allegedly, though I have no evidence to back this up, from somewhere nearer Russia than the United States. According to the press reports, the FBI has helped the company recover some of this money by attacking the Bitcoin wallets of the people who took the money. This is a rather interesting illustration of a cyber criminal attack through something as small as a single compromised password. More on this later. Let me give you another type of attack altogether. This happened just a few years ago, and it's a rather different style, but it illustrates what we're talking about in the cybersecurity attack. In June 2015, the Office of Personnel Management, that's known as OPM, in the United States government, revealed that they'd been the victim of a cyber attack. So what, you might think? But unfortunately, they hold the personnel records for most of the federal employees. This is the federal government employees. They estimated that 4 million records of personal information have been compromised, in effect, stolen. The information concerned, including names, addresses, dates and places of birth, social security numbers, and potentially background information for security clearance. So it was a disappointing range of data that was stolen. It's been described as possibly the worst breach of government data in history, but some of our American colleagues can sometimes exaggerate. I don't know whether that's true. As a further information emerged, though, it was reported the data breach had actually started a year or so earlier in March 2014, but hadn't been noticed until April 2015. And by the 24th of June, the FBI director was reporting to a meeting of senators that the number had grown to 18 million records. So further disappointment by this point. By the 9th of July, the estimate had been revised upwards to 21.5 million records. And in September 2015, it was reported in the New York Times that the fingerprints of 5.6 million US federal employees had also been taken. So altogether, you could find that was a bit embarrassing as a cybersecurity attack. So it turned out, so what's the consequences of these attacks? Well, during the days and weeks after the announcement about the breach, it became apparent that the Inspector General of the Office of Personnel Management, who is employed to look up, to review how agencies are working with their systems, had been warning since at least 2009 about significant weaknesses in the cybersecurity environment arrangements of the agency. The Inspector General had this to say: the continuing weakness in the OPM information security program results directly from inadequate governance. Most, if not all, of the information security exceptions we noted this year resulted from a lack of leadership, policy, and guidance. Subsequent annual reports continue to report those security weaknesses, and every time the organization reported they had made limited progress in addressing them owing to budgetary constraints. In a hearing before the House and an Oversight Committee, the chairman remarked, every year the Office of Director General reviews and rates its respective agencies' compliance with federal information security standards. And according to the last 8 years of IG reports, OPM's data security posture was akin to leaving all the doors and windows open at your house. He also noted 11 out of 47 major information systems lacked proper security authorization. It became apparent during the hearing that many of the agency's systems were outdated and couldn't even encrypt data. We have an interesting situation here, which developed and essentially...
Welcome to Colonial Universe. AUX note.
Yeah, we might have someone else joining us there. The potential consequences for those private information has to be, for those whose private information was stolen, could include blackmail or identity theft. So it was it's serious stuff. And there were consequences again for the leaders. The lady in the picture here with the yellow jacket, Kathleen Archuleta, the director of OPM, tendered her resignation to US President Obama, and it was accepted on the spot. So that would indicate some difficulty. And Donna Seymour, the CIO of this organization, resigned just before she was due to testify to the House. So this is a different sort of example than the previous one I gave you with the Colonial pipeline. This is an example of purely secured systems with inappropriately secured and encrypted data containing personal information about a lot of US government federal employees, which were hacked and the data stolen. It may have been a nation state. I couldn't possibly speculate as to which one, as it's not obvious that this data has been monetized, and that's the key test that would tell you this. This is the sort of attack that will make company directors want to be very careful about how they've secured their VRAR environments in future. Otherwise, they're going to be personally liable as company directors if they were to preside over the sort of debacle clearly that happened there. As we'll see, there's some different considerations when we apply this to AR and VR. So let's move on slightly to a different type of vulnerability. This is a few years ago, so please don't rush off to check if you happen to be wearing one of these. This is an internet-connected device. This is Johnson & Johnson warned in 2016 of that their insulin pump, an example here, was a possible risk of hacking. It actually had been proved possible to hack into it and subvert the insulin pump and change the flow of insulin. Obviously, that has a disappointing effect on the patient at that point if you greatly reduce or enhance their insulin supply. Clearly, it's not just databases and corporate systems can be vulnerable, but individual devices as well. And by the way, if you have one of these devices and are wearing them, please don't get worried. They've since sorted these things out. So with new standards, fortunately for these devices. More of a point for us later as we think about AR and VR. And so sometimes this is an organization, Cybersecurity Ventures, who do some of this work, estimated the size of the world cybercrime economy is roughly will be $10.5 trillion by 2025. It's a bit over 6 trillion, I think, at the moment, but it's growing quite quickly. If that was an economy on its own, this is the cybercrime economy, it would be the world's 3rd largest economy. Gives you an idea of the size of the cybercrime environment. And according to Cybercrime magazine, these cybercrime costs include damage and destruction of data, stolen money, lost productivity, theft of intellectual property, theft of personal and financial data, embezzlement, fraud, post-attack disruption to the normal course of business, forensic investigation, restoration and deletion of hacked data and systems, and reputational harm. So other than that, what else is there to worry about in terms of the possible problems? So, and we'll consider healthcare in a few minutes, but it's perhaps interesting to note that Cybercrime magazine reports that the FBI is particularly concerned with ransomware hitting healthcare providers and hospitals and first responders. And also I noticed that I think it was last year, German authorities reported a ransomware attack which caused the failure of IT systems at a major hospital in Dusseldorf. And a woman who needed urgent admission died after she'd been taken to another city for treatment because of this. Cybercrime is big business, and cyber criminals will operate where they can make money. And that's something we need to think about. And by the way, you could ask, why are we so worried about all this losing data that I've been talking about? Well, here's some examples of the prices for stolen data that are currently being paid by organized criminals, or have been paid by organized criminals from a less visited part of the web where this information is available. But it gives you an idea. By the way, just in case you thought this was cheap, these are US dollars. Just don't want you to misrepresent the costs for you. So it's a very real, cybercrime is a very real issue. And if you're still not convinced, you still don't believe me that cybercrime is real, then follow the money. In the past, some people thought that cyber risk insurance was a novelty. And it recently was up to about number 3, I think, in the Lloyd's category insurance. They don't report it in the same way each time, so it's a bit difficult to tell, but it's up there. And if we expand the use of VR and AR in future, we may well have to factor in how to include them in our cyber risk insurance. And if we do that, the insurers will want to know how the VR AR ecosystem is being secured. Otherwise, they're very unlikely to want to secure it, or they might want to charge a very large premium. So, if cybercrime is very real and it's very big, cyber criminals attack where they can make money. So the use of technology must be sufficiently important to make it worth their while. And there must be some vulnerability in the system that they're attacking. Until now, I would say that VR, AR has been in the early stages of development. I don't mean it hasn't done wonderful things, it has. But in terms of this, of what I've just described, and it hasn't yet been a huge target. It's now predicted that it will grow in importance, as we've all been talking about and indeed all expecting. And as it does, it's going to become more of a target. Indeed, probably, certainly going to become a target. Ignoring the possible risks of this change seems like a very poor option. So there's little doubt, I think, in many people's minds about the promise of immersive technologies. Pradeep identified and talked about some of the things earlier which were going on. And I think this is an area where we now need to start thinking about what all of what I've been saying about cybersecurity means in this context. By the way, I think this is quite a brave lady who's wandering along with those goggles on while doing the cycling, but and they must be particularly good. In particular, it seems like we'll see augmented reality expand into many areas of importance to industry and society. And I mean, I'm just taking a few: only healthcare, manufacturing, retail, cars, and air traffic control. They're just a few of the ones that where we expect them to make a significant difference. Of course, there'll be more. The idea is that it'll improve capability, streamline processes, and reduce costs. It will enable activities that would never be possible before. Now, as with many other technologies, it's very likely that many industries will become dependent on the capability of AR devices and the ICT industry that supports them. I've concentrated a bit more in these examples on AR because the melding of physical and virtual reality, which effectively happens in AR, gives some interesting examples. It's not that what I'm saying about cybersecurity is not true in VR. It has some different environments, but it's probably slightly easier to secure in some ways. What I'd like to do, though, is to ask you to join me on some thought experiments as we try to do what we have to do all the time in cybersecurity and see where we might run into some problems. For any physicists here, I know that Albert Einstein was very big on thought experiments, but I promise that this will be a lot simpler. In the interest of time, I'm just going to explore three areas: healthcare, air traffic control, and AR in vehicles, just as we explore and think through what might occur as we apply some of the things we've just been talking about in cybersecurity. So let's start with healthcare, one of the areas which I think everybody agrees there is an enormous potential to gain for society with the use of AR in healthcare. We're all familiar with the sight of an operating system like this, but come with us as we start our thought journey through what might be possible with AR in the operating theatre. It's been suggested that AR will allow a surgeon to see a patient's medical data and records on an AR-enabled visor or glasses, and to be guided in their operation by using previous X-ray, CT, and MRI scans, together with various previously recorded images, which would also be projected onto that visor. They may also be able to access 3D models, build up the scans, which are built up with the scans which allow the surgeons to determine the best point of entry for the operation on the patient, that is, and to be guided through the operation. Some of this is already beginning to be possible, and much of the rest is being thought about and developed. So how would this work? Well, the visor or AR-enabled glasses being worn by the surgeon will need to be connected to one or more sources of data via a network. It'll probably be a wireless network. That network will need to allow access to a series of databases, for example, the patient's medical records, which are presumably held in a secure location, together with models, scans, general health information, some private, some not. Well, as you say, as we continue the thought experiment, what could possibly go wrong? Well, if the network is not secured, it could be hacked by someone intent on causing harm. This could mean that the data traveling on the network is blocked or modified, particularly if it's not encrypted. For example, a piece of software could be inserted into some part of the system so that it independently communicates with both the visor and the back-end databases, sometimes just relaying data between the two in an innocent way, and sometimes modifying it. Neither party would know that this was happening. This is an example of what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. This could perhaps be achieved by the insertion of a piece of malicious software, often called malware, onto the visor itself, or indeed elsewhere in the ecosystem, if the visor had sufficient capacity and was not secured properly. If the link to the secure medical databases is not completely secured, then an intruder could access or modify that data potentially. and certainly could present the information in an incorrect form to the surgeon doing the work. And the consequences of all this? Well, the theft of not only an individual's personal medical data, but other people's as well. Perhaps worse, it could be maliciously modified so that somebody subsequently had the wrong drugs given to them. If someone wanted to harm the patient, then modifying the information that the surgeon receives about the patient's scans could make the surgeon cut in the wrong area. Perhaps as a last thought, imagine that a ransomware attack occurs during the operation, which renders the visor unusable. Does the surgeon stop the operation, pay the ransom, or both? And if all this seems rather far-fetched, I remind you of already the death of a German patient that I mentioned earlier. Ah, but you say, surely medical software itself is at least highly secure, even if the AR components are not. Sadly, it seems not. By the way of an example, Intertrust does an annual report of health applications. Highlights from the report include 71% of tested medical apps have at least one high-level security vulnerability. A vulnerability, by the way, is classified as high if it can be readily exploited and has the potential for significant damage or loss. The vast majority of medical apps, that's 91%, have mishandled and or weak encryption that puts them at risk for data exposure. The majority of mHealth apps contain multiple security issues with data storage. For example, 60% of tested Android apps store data in shared preferences, leaving unencrypted data readily readable and editable by attackers and malicious apps. And when looking specifically at COVID tracking apps, they found that 85% leaked data. Their final report was that 83% of the high-level threats discovered could have been mitigated using application protection technologies such as code obfuscation, tampering detection, and white box cryptography. And remember what we said earlier, cyber criminals will use vulnerabilities to make money where the target is sufficiently able to be exploited. And now, for those who are a bit squeamish about health matters, let's briefly turn our mind to think about an experiment of air traffic control. This is clearly an old picture trying to predict the future. Actually, it's from NASA. And you can see that from some of the rather large screens they've got there. But a number of companies have started developing systems, reasonably enough, which will blend real-time data, generated data, into the real-world view. Some are doing this using glasses or visors. Just as with our medical example, this will entail network connections and access to databases with what may be sensitive information. And just as with the medical example, this data could be blocked or worse, modified to give controllers a completely inaccurate set of information. If this is the only source of additional data the controller needs, then a ransomware attack or a distributed denial of service attack could stop the controller from receiving the information. The outcomes are obvious, as illustrated by this aircraft, which has not exactly covered itself in glory. In my misspent youth, I was a pilot at university, and it was brought home to me often how much pilots rely on good, accurate information from the control tower. I wouldn't want to be in a position where that information could be regarded as tampered with. And the final thought experiment we might go to is perhaps a longer way off, but worth touching on if you of course, if you aren't already worried by some of these activities. AR is on the verge of changing, as we know, how we live and work. And it's also going to change the way we drive, with AR automotive technologies now starting to hit the fast lane. Leading car manufacturers and service vendors are investing millions in the development of AI and AR-powered tech systems that will reinvent the driving experience. By the way, please don't try what this person in the picture is doing by both texting and driving at the same time. Wait until there's a lot more AR in place, and indeed that it's legal. But I see the steering wheel's on the wrong side of the car, so it's obviously not in Australia. The ABI research predicted in 2019 that the total AR auto market will grow at an annual rate of 177%, reaching about $5.5 billion by 2022. And already head-up displays are being enhanced with additional driver and navigational information. And there's a lot more going on in that space. Once again, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just as in our other examples, many of these new car systems will require some sort of network connectivity, often in this case 5G, and access to external data. The network must be protected, the external database must be protected, and any internal database on the car must be protected. And if not, the consequences are obvious. Someone with malicious intent could cause the driver to receive incorrect, augmented information. Perhaps the driver could be directed down non-existent roads or given false information about other cars on the road. Perhaps this false information could cause the driver to undertake an unnecessary stop, causing a crash. If you think about this, there are many ways that a driver's experience could be subverted if the new ARs or enhanced systems in the cars are vulnerable. So we see the potential for the same sort of attacks on VR and AR devices as we would on any network connected component. There's unfortunately no great evidence at the moment that AR systems have been designed with security in mind, VR systems. This is a general statement. There will be some, no doubt, designed excellently with security in mind and some not. They could have many of the same vulnerabilities as other devices, monitoring of data by third parties, ransomware attacks, DDoS attacks, that's distributed denial of service attacks, stopping access to the network, or stealing of the credentials, for example, passwords and so on. These are the same for most components for ICT in an ecosystem, but interesting, an additional one perhaps that we might think of for AR and VR is that the device being worn by someone can record their eye movements, and this data would be quite enough to identify or impersonate them. Now, of course, I'm not saying that these vulnerabilities exist in all VR and AR devices, just that it appears that in the race between increased functionality and robust security, it must be said that it's not absolutely clear that robust security is always winning. And for those directors of companies making use of AR, VR, you will be accountable for any security issues, just as you are for the security issues in any other part of your organization. So what can we do about it? Is there anything we can do to improve things? First of all, we must remember that the systems and devices we've been talking about will become much more attractive to cyber criminals as they become more embedded in and essential to a particular environment. Perhaps a time now for a call to arms from VRARA about how to address the issue. I would suggest we might think about these in three parts. First, we need to apply the sort of security standards that we apply more generally to corporate and government networks. Secondly, we need some security guidelines or standards for VR and AR devices and that manufacturers might adhere to. And third, we need to consider how to encourage more people to gain skills in this area, or we won't actually have the resources to support the industry as it expands. I'll deal with those just briefly. First, and most obviously, we need to apply the same security standards that we use elsewhere. For example, encrypt all network traffic, encrypt data at rest and in transit, ensure that the devices can be properly secured, insist on enterprise level Wi-Fi encryption on a VR AR device. Not all of them seem to have that. And don't select the device if it doesn't support it. Ensure that there are means of checking that a wearable device is not hosting malware and is not physically compromised. Putting something physically in the device can also compromise it. Don't connect it to the internet if you don't have to. And consider, by that I mean, consider using local infrastructure only. In other words, the database is hosted locally without an internet connection or a cloud connection. If the data is being stored in the cloud, be very wary about the jurisdiction in which it's being stored, because you're potentially storing personal or private data in a jurisdiction, you could be in a jurisdiction that you don't know about, and that could give interesting privacy, legal privacy concerns. And finally, consider sometimes whether rather using glasses or goggles or visors, you might consider whether a projection-based system might be more secure. Just talking about, secondly, about standards, after a period in which considerable concern had been expressed about the cyber safety of Internet of Things devices or IoT devices, NIST, that's the National Institute of Science and Technology, I think I got that right, issued draft guidance documents on cybersecurity in IoT devices. They've clearly fired all their marketing people because they've got the imaginatively titled reports of special publication SP 800-213, which is the main report, and they back that up with NIST interagency reports, NIST IRS 8259B, C, and D. So clearly they worked hard on the naming convention for these reports, but they're actually very good and they can give further guidance. This is for IoT. They really do give excellent guidance. For example, things like what's the benefit of the IoT device and how will it be utilized? What data is collected? In what technologies will the data be stored? In what geographic areas will the data be shared and or stored? With what other third parties will data from or about the IoT devices be shared? These are sensible guidelines and the start of standards. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has also issued some draft guide for securing IoT together with 13 principles. They had wanted to have more than the 5 that the US had, I think. So given the similarity between IoT devices and some of the VR, AR devices, it may well be time for our community to push for similar guidance. Perhaps there's something for VRARA to take up, Pradeep. And finally, I'm just going to suggest that we're going to have to do something about skills. The latest ACS Digital Pulse, that's Australian Computer Society Digital Pulse, which is an annual review of the IT industry and ecosystem, which they do in collaboration with Deloitte Access Economics, paints a pretty bleak picture on skills everywhere. But this is for Australia. In summary, you can see from the figures I put up there, which are all about technology workers, not just VRAR, but the technology workers in general, that we don't produce anywhere near enough ICT graduates to meet demand, industry demand. Picture's worse for cybersecurity, and I have no idea what it is for VRAR, but I'm not particularly encouraged either by the figures that we're seeing here. So the question I would pose is, how does the VRAR industry and us as an association engage with education providers of all sorts, universities, TAFEs, private providers, to provide meaningful skills acquisition in this area, along with some effective accreditation of those skills, which ultimately will be necessary as our market matures. We have previously supplemented our skills shortage with immigration. For obvious reasons, that isn't happening right now. Without skilled people, it would be very difficult for the industry to fulfill its potential. And with that hospital pass to Pradeep, I'm happy, of course, to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was a lovely presentation. I enjoyed it a hell of a lot. A couple of questions come to my mind. And the first question, when I look at it—
Shall I stop sharing, Pradeep?
Was that?
Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, please. Please stop sharing. Yes.
Done.
So the first question which comes to my mind is that let's take two situations, an enterprise situation and a consumer situation. Let's take the consumer situation first. I am sitting at my home. I, plug in a head-mounted device, a VR head-mounted device. Now, I am going on the assumption that the network, whether it is by Telstra or Optus, is being protected adequately. My own laptop has got Norton or whatever antivirus software. Am I exposing myself? Am I creating additional levels of risk by introducing the head-mounted device? This is the home environment first that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I understand. The chances are you may well be doing so. If you're not now, you probably will in the future, unless the various software protection devices, software protection companies include malware which is specifically targeted at the devices that you're talking about. Because if you were a cyber criminal and you felt it was sufficiently useful to do something with the devices, the AR devices in the home environment I'm talking about for the moment, then if you wanted to attack them, the simplest way to do that would be to find some way of distributing malware to those devices via the network and via the internet to which your home environment will be served. So unless they, the Nortons, the McAfees, the whatever software antivirus stuff can pick those up, then you'll be a problem. But if they start picking them up, or if they become sufficiently important to pick up, then the chances are you might be much more protected than you think. It will depend on that, and we aren't there yet. So it's going to be a question of working out whether that will be the case in future.
Lost it to the house.
Okay. Murray, can you mute yourself, please? Now, let me give you another situation, which is the enterprise situation. I walk into an office or a hospital or whatever it might be. I am going to be giving a demo on VR for training. I am happily going there thinking that the standard operating environment of the enterprise will protect me. I'm not doing anything at all. So what happens when I walk in there with my head-mounted device and plug it in?
Well, first of all, you're making an assumption, aren't you, that the standard operating environment in the organization to whom you're going in is going to protect you. It may or may not do so. You don't know that without checking. Secondly, you don't know whether you're taking a piece of malware on your device into that network. So they will actually want to be much, they should be much more careful about letting you plug in than just letting you plug it in, because if it's possible for malware to infect the device, then it's possible for you to bring that in, just as many organizations have a restriction on pushing, put USB memory drives in. If you go into a government office, they're not going to let you put a USB memory drive into the device. They're most unlikely because of the possibility of that being subverting their own network. In that case, you should think of the headset that you're talking about. They should consider it in the same way as a potential danger. They will want a way to deal with it. And if they want a way to deal with it, then you need to know a way of ensuring that they can demonstrate, as I said in my talk, that device does not host malware. That's the key issue. The SOE will protect you from the internet, will protect those things, but they should want to make sure, not so much you, that that they can check on your device that it isn't hosting malware and it isn't going to cause them a problem. That will be the key thing.
Okay, and Andrew's making a very interesting comment, and he says that, look, it's very easy to introduce a malware in a system. And some of the HMDs require the user to sign up, allowing data collection. But let me, in this context, give you a recent study or a research which was done by University of Connecticut. They actually introduced a malware in an enterprise environment. And with that malware, they were able to change the digital content. Not only that, but imagine that you are able to change the digital boundaries. So from a safety perspective, that can become a big issue. So this is one side of the story, And so therefore, what we are saying is, but you see that the challenge at the moment is that we don't see that rigor when walking into the enterprise, and the enterprise is very rightly concerned about, or should be concerned about the additional risks which are being introduced in the system. So it becomes, onto both the solution providers as well as the potential customers to jointly address this, as you rightly said, and to get certain standards in place for this. But that is easier said than done. You got proprietary technologies, you've got open. We all know what happened in the case of Linux versus other things. The same story is going to play out in VRARA also. Yeah. Now, let's kind of now let me see who says. Rehan is saying, they say it's impossible to make a perfectly secure system. Most data breach noticed after a while. And are there any software that can monitor networks and notify? Oh yes, Rehan, there is plenty of tracking devices on the network. The challenge is not in terms of whether they are available or not. The challenge is in terms of, are we taking all these factors into account when we are introducing head-mounted devices and additional software into an enterprise or a home environment? Now, I want to come down to another question, and this comes back to the example that you gave of that pipeline in the US, where they paid a ransom of, I don't remember, some $5 or $6 million. But that's one side of the story. And I believe this ransom was paid in Bitcoins. But the interesting part is that FBI was able to break into the digital wallet of the guys who were collecting the ransom and get the money back. Now, why this becomes important is that we are now talking of blending of blockchain and immersive technologies. We are talking of, economic value which is being added by trading in digital assets through NFTs. But if the FBI is able to break into some digital wallet over here, then what is this we are talking about? The entire premise of commerce in a virtual environment becomes open to question.
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Yes. And I see someone I'm looking at, I think it's Rehan, yes, said it's impossible to make a perfectly secure system. It's completely impossible to make a perfectly secure system. If you want to make it really secure, unplug it from the internet, because you'll make it a lot more secure. But that's just not practical for much of the stuff we do. So if in terms of what you were describing just there, yes, the FBI can attack these. Some of these people that we're talking about, some of the criminals are not too good at securing their own systems. And sometimes they're using third-party, for Bitcoins, for example, they'll be using third-party cryptocurrencies exchanges, which may or may not have weaknesses. And I couldn't speculate on whether the FBI would know about those weaknesses to go in and access them. But yes, if someone is sufficient, particularly a nation state, by the way, is sufficiently interested in getting access to your data, they will get access to it. I won't name any particular states. There'll be some more capable than others of doing that, but they would be able to get access to it. The question is really, in discussion here, is the target sufficiently important? So in the case of an operation that I gave the target, you would say that they could persuade the hospital to part with a lot of money in a ransomware attack, but particularly if they were interfering with the operations during live operations or were threatening to do so. There's a big ability to cause disruption and therefore get money out of the victims in this case. In a home environment, for example, it's not as obvious that there's as much money to be had, and so it probably isn't going to be the biggest target for the environment, but it could be. But as you say, it doesn't, just because we're introducing another device or devices into an enterprise environment does not mean it should be any less thorough about the cybersecurity you have. But if the device itself, for example, I see reports, and I don't know how accurate they are, so I'm not going to make it as a firm statement, that some of the devices can't use enterprise level Wi-Fi encryption. Now, that's a problem. If it can't do that, then it's possible that you've immediately got a vulnerability at that point. And obviously Wi-Fi signals go outside the walls of your building. And so someone, in some cases at any rate, and in some cases people could then access in those ways. So cybersecurity is a dismal science, At the best of times, we're always looking for things that could go wrong, as opposed to, I hope in the AR, VR community, we're all looking for what the potential for the future is. But the bottom line is you've got to merge the two, because if we go and put in something fantastic that everybody gets dependent upon, and it's not secure, the consequences could be very severe.
So here's a question from Tanya. She's saying that, do you see the risk with a decentralized 5G network encouraging cloud streaming directly to mobile head-mounted devices?
Well, the cloud streaming, yes, it could go directly from across the network to mobile headsets, but the cloud, it would depend on first of all, the security of that will depend on the layers of security on those bits of the network that goes directly to it. The cloud itself will be secured by the cloud providers, and the access to their immediate network will be secured. The question is really, in those circumstances, it's possible that you'll do that, but in those circumstances, will for example, will the headset, but I'm talking about the mobile phone headsets here, be appropriately secured? Will the local network distributions, that is with the local telcos, be appropriately secured? And without knowing that, you can't say whether or not it'll be secure or not.
And Andrew was making another very interesting observation, which he's saying is that geographical regions for XR cloud services is the clear issue for the future. I will go even one step further. I will say that we are already talking in terms of building up mini metaverses. You know, Facebook is building its own. Epic Game has got Foresight. So many other mini metaverses are coming along. Now, when it comes to a mini metaverse, we are talking of a universe which kind of blends the virtual and the real world. What happens to national boundaries?
Well, I mean, an example, this is a simpler example, but it then pertains to this. I remember talking to someone in a community who was inadvertently storing data on a cloud environment, which was considered personal and private data, so under the current rules in Australia. And when I looked at it, it's clear they were storing it on a cloud in Canada without any of the permission of the users. Now that's illegal. So I'm obviously not going to say about the individual, but and it's quickly sorted out and dealt with. So the issue for us is here, if, for example, as I was saying earlier, storing the eye movements, if that's what we're doing, from people using glasses or visors could well be personally identifiable. It potentially is so. So is that personal and private data? And if so, can it be, if you were in Australia, can it be stored outside Australia? Now, the lawyers haven't given us a straight answer to some of these questions yet, and it may take a while for us to get a straight answer from some of those, but it's a moot point. And if you're storing any of the other credentials on cloud services, which are outside Australia without the permission of the users to do so, that causes you some issues. If on the other hand, let's imagine you were merging the data from 5 different countries, just for the sake of argument, to form the metaverse that you're talking about, Pradeep, how do you put this? Where do you put this data? You're going to have to get an awful lot of permissions from the people using it to be able to store the data outside the environment. Now that's perfectly possible to do, but it's not always done by organizations. And this is another example where people could be tripped up inadvertently. So Andrew's point is extremely important. It's exactly right. You could end up very easily storing data without permission outside the jurisdiction in which you're allowed to store it.
Here's a question by Prasad. He says, as an AR VR solution provider, to enterprises, what are the recommended standards that must be adhered to? And
well,
he's he's also, of course, referring to ISO and all that. But in general, the question would be, yes, are there any standards that one could adhere? Or are there recommended standards?
I don't think there are in the AR VR. I mean, the standards that you're talking about there, the ISO 27001, 27002 are general security standards, and it's always good to do that. But much of that is to do with enterprise security. In the case of the standards or the guidance that NIST has done for IoT environment, some of that guidance is good. The NIST and the Australian Cybersecurity guidance, because IoT AR VR devices are not that dissimilar in that sense, in a general sense, to IoT devices. So that would be good. And as somebody said, the Australia ACSC requirements for some guidance material. As I said earlier in my presentation, there's 13, they put out, this is for IoT stuff, 13 guidance principles, but they're quite general. And it does require, so, be certain you know who you're sharing your data with. These are really very general, very straightforward cybersecurity principles. So there are those principles that are coming through for things like IoT, which would be generally applicable. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, but I don't know of any that are specific to the AR and VR environment. And I also am not certain that, I mean, the general security recommendations are 27,000 actually they've got another number, I think now. But those security environments, security standards are useful in a lot of the back end stuff, but it's not at all clear to me how they would actually apply to the devices that we're talking about, or and it would be very general in its application to the ecosystem. We're talking about some basic stuff. Do you encrypt the data here? Do you make sure that your networks to and from the device is secure? Is the device capable of hosting mass malware? If it's not, then that's fine. If it is, well, how do you check it and how do you make sure it's not doing it?
And Andrew is, of course, giving a suggestion that if in Australia, to look at ACSC requirements for some guidance.
That's right. Those are the 13 guidance principles that I mentioned in my presentation. Yeah.
Now, Mayur has made an interesting observation as well as a question. And the question relates to US Army is increasingly using XR. He has, of course, mentioned security, but they're using it for a number of purposes, primarily training. Now, they recently signed a $20 billion order with Microsoft. This question is that, are you aware of what kind of security protocols, etc., are being used by US Army?
No, I'm not. I mean,
I would have thought so, because if you were, then you might have been under the site of the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else.
That's right. Regrettably, the US Army has not shared its protocols with me, but I mean, the Microsoft devices are great devices to look at, and I certainly hope. I mean, clearly, what you said in there, what Mayur has said in there, it relates to fantastic outcomes if it can be achieved. And I'm sure they wouldn't have started if they didn't think they could achieve it. But they better be pretty clear. A lot of that stuff, though, in doing the service, you would think, oh, well, that's not too much of a worry. It's not indirectly in line, like running a car or air traffic control or medicine. But, you know, getting the maintenance wrong on some important device, like a nuclear bomb or something, would be considered quite disappointing if it was wrong. And I hope that they've employed adequate security in there. Let us hope so. I'm afraid I'm not aware of it, though. I'm not certain they'll share it with us.
So we are now almost at 57 minutes past the hour. And I was going to keep the session for 45 minutes, but it's gone on much longer. Any last minute questions by anybody? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. From my perspective, I think there is some comment which is one thought to consider is the end of life devices. It is impossible to sanitize the SSDs. So what considerations are being made to destructive, particularly of the rate of development we are seeing? Oh, this is a very interesting question, and I think we need to get and we've got some decent global members. What I will do is, because it is obviously this subject is a hot button. And, we not only need to engage or, continue the process of education of everybody, but also, we are already in discussions in trying to get standards for VR here in general. Leave aside the cybersecurity aspects of that. The biggest challenge, of course, is that there are so many groups who are working on standards. To get them to talk to each other also is a challenge. And then you got, the conflict between the proprietary and the open source technologies. But that will always happen. So I will simply end the discussion today by saying that thank you, Nick, for the lovely session. Thank you all for your active participation. And this is going to be a regular series that will continue down. And I encourage contribution by everybody. There have been some lovely comments coming through from Andrew, some good questions coming through from Tanya and from Prasad, and some good observations by Mayur and a couple of other people. Let's keep the discussion, keep the flow going, and let's make ourselves, and from a VRARA perspective, I will make sure that I sink in what is happening globally on this issue. With that, once again, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you all for attending, and look forward to the next session on this. There are a series of sessions that we are going to have on different themes. There is one on intellectual property. There is one on cybersecurity. And we will also, at the moment, I've kickstarted a discussion in creating a Asia Pacific and Europe corridor. Now, what does that mean? That essentially means that in between we will get, two countries to be showcasing the capability in terms of XR and looking at how the companies can add value by collaborating across this corridor. So this discussion has been kickstarted just about a week back, and the tentative timelines at the moment we are looking at is November, because we've got some global summits also happening, and it does take some time to plan an international event. But I'll keep you all folks updated on this. There's lots more happening, and in fact, there's tons more happening. And this is just the right time to be in AR, VR. As Tanya will tell you, that yes, she is actually floating in dollars. Oh, my apologies. It's not her, but the company she works for is floating in dollars, or work, let me put it this way. But that's a reality. The kind of explosion that we've seen in the COVID and the post-COVID kind of a phase, and this is the positive aspect, the only positive aspect of COVID that I can think of, But it is a fabulous time to be in immersive technologies. Bye for now. Enjoy your evening glass of wine or a morning cup of tea in whichever part of the world you are. Till next time, this is Pradeep signing off.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thanks.